Hello to everybody. Hello to everyone and welcome to Hadran Siyum Masechet Nedarim. It's great to see you all here. It's always exciting, as if it's our first time together, and just looking at all the faces and all the people from all around the world. It's always a pleasure to be learning together and to have the opportunity. Last night it was nice. I was in Jerusalem. I had the opportunity to teach a little bit in person and meet some of the people who've been learning from farther away. I got to learn with some people in Ranana, and now today with all of you. It's a real pleasure. Siyum Masechet Nedarim is sponsored by Sharona Schuster in memory of her father, Eliyahu Chaim ben Aharav Ephraim, and mother-in-law, Dvorah Bat Yisrael, both of whom will have a legacy of Torah and mitzvot among their children and grandchildren, and to my husband who believed in me and encouraged me to learn with Hadran. Also a mazel tov to the Hadran community. And the Siyum Masechet Nedarim is also sponsored by Miriam Kersner, the sister of, and her children, Lana and Sheldon and Jamie and Elaine Greenstone, Elaine, the wife of, in honor of Barry Dove Greenstone. With great determination, at the age of 15, in 1957, finished Masechet Nedarim with his Rebbe, Rabbi Herzl Kaplan, Zichrono Livracha, at the Hebrew Theological College in Skokie. Okay, so thank you very much to our sponsors. And the program is as usual, but I'll review what we're going to be doing. We're going to be finishing Masechet Nedarim today. We have a very interesting and a bit off, I don't know what to say about it, but a little bit different of a daf for today. And as you already, if you already learned yesterday's daf, you'll know where we're going. And then we're going to do the Hadran. We're going to learn the beginning of the first Mishnah in Masechet Nazir. And then we will hear from our two excellent speakers, Advocate Michal Cotler-Wunsh and Rabbanit Dr. Adina Sternberg. So without further ado, we'll get started with our daf. I want to do a quick review of the Mishnah because it's going to be at the basis of what we're going to be learning tonight, which is we had two stages. Remember, we've talked about this, how it's very common in Mishnayot, where there's two stages. There was a certain point where the rabbis thought something, and then they changed their mind based on something else. So in the beginning, they believed three women who had the following claims. So these women claimed, number one, either Tme'ani Lacha was a woman married to a Kohen who was raped. Notice in the Mishnah, it never said that she's married to a Kohen. We're going to get to it in the Gemara today, but it's hard to understand it without it. And then basically she says, I was raped, and that means he's going to have to divorce her and give her all the k'tuba money because it wasn't necessarily it wasn't at all her fault. Shamayim beni lebencha. Again, we saw different interpretations, but we'll go with the way the Bavli is going to understand it, which is she claims the reason we don't have children is because you're impotent and it's your problem, and therefore, please let me get divorced so I can have children. And again, I deserve my k'tuba money. And Nitulani Mini Yehudim, which says, I don't want to have sexual relations with anybody at all. She's vowing off of it. And basically the assumption is it's painful for her, and therefore she also gets to be let out of the marriage and gets her k'tuba money, again, according to most of the interpretations. Then Chazru Lomar, and here's the really interesting line, because Chazru Lomar, as I told you, it's a very common structure to have it used to be, and then usually it's followed by Misherabu ha'anasim or Misherabu ha'ganavim, when all of a sudden there were all these thieves, when there were all these liars, when there were all these blah, 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 whatever it might be, fill in the blank. Then they change things. In this case, it doesn't say Misherabu haramaim, which is women who were taking advantage, but it says we're worried that a woman might, they don't know that women were doing this, but they were worried that maybe a woman, they tried to kind of put themselves in women's shoes, which, never know what happens when that happens, but they tried to say, maybe the women would lie because, why would a woman lie? This is, again, we've talked about this when you have the screaming women in the Gemara. The women often felt they had no way out, and the rabbis understood that. They realized that women were stuck in the situation. It was a complicated situation where they can't get out of a marriage because they can't issue the divorce, initiate it. So therefore, they said maybe she falls in love with somebody else. And therefore, in the end, right, she's going to basically try to lie to her husband in order to get out of the marriage. And therefore, I'm not going to get into all the details of what they do for each one, but each one has its own kind of, as a result, they decided if she claims this, we're not going to believe her necessarily, and therefore, what we already saw. So now we start with Rav Papa. We're now starting 5 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Amud Bet. Amar Rav Papa, Badik Lam Rava. Rava would check his students and quiz them on the following question. Eshet Kohen Shenensa. Oh, this is when you start feeling good that you learned Daf Yomi, because if I asked you this question and you learned the Daf already, you'd say, oh, I know this answer to this question. So Rav Papa says, Rava would check us with the following question. If a woman is raped, does she get her k'tuba money or not get her k'tuba money if she's married to a Kohen and she has to get divorced? So, kevan de ones gabe ratzon, ones legabe Kohen, ratzon legabe Israel, dame en la k'tuba. Since a woman who is raped and is married to a Kohen has a similar law to a woman who went willingly into a relationship with another man while she was married, if she was married to a Yisrael, she wouldn't get her k'tuba money in that case, so maybe it should be the same. Or do we say, no, really, she could say, it's not my issue, right? Number one, right, I was raped. Number two, it's not really a problem for me. It's a problem for you. You're the Kohen, and sorry, but it's your issue, not mine. So they answered him, as you would have answered, it's the Mishnah. And how do we know? Now, the truth is, it's not like it was so clear in the Mishnah. It was clear to you because I explained it that way. But the Mishnah never said she was married to a Kohen. So now we have to figure out, how do we know it's talking about a case if she's married to a Kohen? It says in our Mishnah, if she says I was raped, she gets a k'tuba. Now there's two possibilities, and within those two possibilities, there's two options. Meaning she could be married to a Kohen or she could be married to a Yisrael. It could have been, I was raped. It could have been, I was with another man. So we're going to have to play out all those options. And this is what we call a process of elimination. We're going to reject one by one. Until we're left with, it could only be a woman who's married to a Kohen and claims she was raped. So here we go through all the options. If you're going to say it's a woman who is married to a Yisrael, a regular Jew, okay, so she's married to a Jew and she does it intentionally. She decides to cheat on her husband. Of course, she doesn't get her k'tuba money. Iba ones, if she was raped, well then, mika mitasra al gavra. She's not forbidden to her husband. She could stay married if he's not a Kohen. Therefore, move into track 2. Ela be'eshet Kohen. Iba ratzon. So either if she's married to a Kohen and she willingly went into this relationship, klum yesh la k'tuba. Of course, she's not going to get her k'tuba money. She cheated on her husband. Mi gara me'eshet Israel beratzon. Is she no worse? Just because she's married to a Kohen doesn't mean we're going to give her her k'tuba money. Of course not. Elalav be'ones. It must be its ones. She was raped. Ve'katana yesh la k'tuba. And the Mishnah says clearly she gets her k'tuba. Okay, so done with that. We now have our answer and we can move on. Next question. Now we're getting into another question about believability. This really is sounding a lot like what we learned in Ketubah with all those questions of who's believed when there's a debate between the couple. So they asked the following question. Amra leba'ala gerashtani. She goes to her husband and says, you divorced me. Mahu. She goes into a court. She claims she's divorced. Is she believed? The husband says, I didn't divorce you. Amar Rav Hamnuna, right? Obviously, they're from some other town and there's no proof and we don't know. And they come to some new city and he says, we're married. And she says, we're not. We got divorced. Is she believed? So we're going to have a debate, Rav Hamnuna and Rava. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have a debate. And then we're going to bring different parts of our Mishnah to question each side. So Amar Rav Hamnuna Tashma. It's helpful in this case, because we want to question both sides, that our Mishnah has the first stage and the second stage. So we're going to question each one from a different stage when we either do believe or don't believe. So now Rav Hamnuna says, let's learn it from here, our Mishnah. She says, I was raped. Even in the second stage, when we don't believe her, why don't we believe her? It's easy for her to lie in that case. Why is it easy? Because he has no idea. She can make up anything she wants and he'll have no way to know. So she's not embarrassed to go in front of him and lie because he has no way of knowing that she's lying. But if she says you divorced me, obviously he knows what the truth is, right? Try to imagine going to someone who you know you're lying to in their face and they know you're lying. It's a little bit hard to get up and do that. And in fact, he's going to put it into words like this. The yadaba, right? Since he knows, mehemna, she's believed. The chazaka, this is a word they like to use in the Gemara. There's a chazaka means we go by assumptions. The working assumption is, Ein isha mi'izah paneha bifnei ba'ala. A woman will not have the audacity to lie in the face of her husband if he knows that she's lying. That would be crazy. So Rav Hamnuna says, that's why Gei Rashtani will believe her. But she says it was rape. We're not going to believe her. That's why in the end, they don't believe her, right? And we question her credibility there. That wouldn't apply to a case of Gei Rashtani. Amarle Rava says, what are you talking about? Adarabah, it's the exact opposite. Let's go back to the first part. When in the first part of the Mishnah, they said, she's believed when she says she's raped. Why was she originally believed? Yes, there was some concern later. They thought maybe she was lying. But originally, they did believe her. Now, this is a very, very true line. I think you can all relate to this, which is, of course, she's believed. A woman to get up in court and lie and say she was raped, right? It's humiliating to get up in court and say, I was raped, right? It's a very difficult thing for a woman to get up and say those words. And I think nowadays, the push is to say, don't be embarrassed by it. It's okay, right? You did nothing wrong, and it's not embarrassing to say this. But the truth is, it's right. Most women, certainly in those days, and even nowadays, it's hard. It's hard to get up to make that move and admit in a public court in front of other people that this is something that happened. So therefore, that's why she's believed, because how could a woman humiliate herself just to lie, right? Just to get divorced? I mean, yes, to get divorced is a big thing, but to say I was raped, like try to find some other way. But in this case of Gei Rashtani, it could be that she really just wants to get out of the marriage. Different interpretations of what takifla is, but she's angry with him. She's upset being in the relationship. Therefore, she might be willing to lie in front of his face and say, you divorced me, hoping that maybe she'll be able to convince people that she's right. And forget about what Rav Hamnuna said about, she wouldn't lie to her husband. That's something he knows. So they each basically, I said that we're going to use our Mishnah to question them, but the truth is they're each actually using their Mishnah right now to prove. One uses the Mishnah Rishona, one uses the Mishnah Achrona to prove and to get to an answer to this question. So now here come our questions. Mativ Rav Misharshia. Rav Misharshia now comes and questions Rav first. The last one we just ended with. Hashamayim beni lebencha. So now let's go to the second claim. She claims it's his fault that they don't have children. He's impotent. So Hashamayim beni lebencha, according to Mishnah Rishona, she's believed, right? Now, that's a tiyuv to derava. Why? Because isn't hacha deleitle kisufa? It's no embarrassment for her to go into court and say this. Why is it no embarrassment? Because it has nothing to do with her. It's his problem, not her problem. Vikatani de mehemna, and yet we say she's believed. If your logic, Rava, is that when it's humiliating for her, she wouldn't say it unless it was true, well, this creates a problem because this, we believe her, even though it's not humiliating for her. To which they say, very interesting response, Kasava Rava, Hatam, Kevan de lo sage, de lo amra, ein yoreh kechetz, ilo ita kedika amra lo amrele. So what are you talking about? She's not embarrassed. Of course she's humiliated. Why do you think she used the words, heaven and earth is between us, or the heavens are between us, however you translate it, when she really means he's impotent? Why does she change the words? Because it's humiliating for her to get up in court and say it. It's true, it's not her, but what's the difference? It's hanging out her dirty laundry of what's going on inside her bedroom in a public court. Of course, that's humiliating for her. And the proof that it's humiliating is the fact that the words used is a euphemism and it's not actually saying it directly. So therefore, that's how Rava answers the question. Next, we're now going to go to the second part of Hashamayim beni lebencha in the Mishnah Achrona, once they changed the law. Hashamayim beni lebencha de Mishnah Achrona tavi tiyuvta de Rav Hamnuna. Because what did Rav Hamnuna say? Rav Hamnuna said she wouldn't lie in his face if he knew the truth, right? If it was something they both know, like you divorced me, either you did or you didn't, and she wouldn't lie if he really hadn't divorced her. Well, what about this case? Ha ha ha, de yadehi, v'bala yadaba. They both know about this, right? He knows he's impotent. She knows he's impotent. So therefore, v'katani de lo mehemna, and yet we don't believe her. So what happened to your Ein isha mi'izah bifnei ba'ala? She would never dare to say such a thing if he knows the truth. So, Kasavar Rav Hamnuna, what's the answer? Very interesting the way they keep twisting these back and forth. Hachanami hi gufa amra. She would say in this case, it's actually fascinating. Again, if you go, I was being very particular in terms of the wording of the Mishnah and how they view the woman and what she's thinking, and that they actually don't know that the woman was thinking this. Now they're also trying to get into the woman's head, and they say, perhaps the woman thinks that he doesn't know, right? He might know, right? He doesn't necessarily know that he's impotent, because it goes on in her body. She could feel that he's impotent. She might not know. It doesn't say anything whether he knows or doesn't know, but she might not know. She might think that he might not know. And therefore, Mishum Hachi Meshachar, she has no problem lying because she doesn't think he really has any clue whether it's his problem or not. Only she knows. And therefore, theoretically, it could be something she would lie about. So basically what we did was we took a separate question about, is a woman believed when it comes to divorce? We tried to use our Mishnah to prove it. Each one took a different part of the Mishnah, whether it's the Mishnah Rishon or the Mishnah Achron or the first stage or the second stage, to prove their point from the rape case. And then we brought the second case to kind of question each side. And in the end, are left with our two opinions because each one was able to at least support his by using something. Now we're going to end our sugya with 4 stories. They're going to break up into two stories of one type and 2 stories of another type. And the first 2 we're going to deal with Rav Nachman's going to be the rabbi who comes in. The second 2 are going to be with Rava. Every time after having relations, this woman would wash her husband's hands. It was for impurity reasons, not so clear, but that was what they would do. One day she brings him water to wash his hands. He says, why are you bringing me water? We didn't have relations last night. She says, oh, well, maybe, yesterday there were some workers in the house. There were people selling bisamim. They were selling perfumes. They came into the house, and maybe he says, if it wasn't you, Dilma Minhon, maybe it was one of them. Okay, a little bit of an absurd story. She ends up having relations with somebody she didn't even know who they were. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, wait, this story sounds very fishy. He says, she must be having eyes for somebody else and set up this whole thing, did the whole thing in order just to get you to think that she was with someone else. Now, what was the problem? It must be he was a Kohen. And if he's a Kohen and she was with someone else, they're going to actually basically assume that this is like a rape case because she didn't do it on purpose, but she must have been married to a Kohen and the Kohen won't be able to be with her anymore. So she's trying to get out of the marriage. So she basically sets up this whole thing. Another story, another woman, she was looking pretty unhappy with her husband. There's actually some other interpretations that say the reverse. That usually she was unhappy. Today, that day she was happy, but we'll go with, she had like a sour face on about her husband that day. He says to her, what's different about today? What are you so upset with me about? So she says, when we had relations last, it was really painful. It's never been like that before. He says, He says, I know what you're talking about. We didn't even have relations. What are you referring to? So just like the story before, she says, if so, those Gentiles who were selling neft, remember we had this, it's interesting, the juxtaposition of the perfume and the neft, right? We had this, how a woman would never adorn herself with neft. You remember we had that whole thing? Anyway, these Gentiles were selling them. They were here yesterday. If it wasn't you, maybe it was one of them. Amar lehu Rav Nachman, lo tishkachum be. Rav Nachman says, don't listen to this woman. Lo tishkachum ba, notenet eneha b'acher have. Okay, and he, pushes off her claim as if she's clearly just lying here. And bottom line, you do not have to divorce her. hold off because I'm going to wait till I get to the very, very end, and then I'm going to try to help us make sense of all these stories. What are they doing here? What do they have to do with this Masechet? And why is our Masechet ending with these crazy stories? Next, last set of stories. Hahu Gavra. Now we get to a situation where there's a man in the house alone with the woman. Okay, she's a married woman. Al ate mari de bete, the owner of the house walks in, her husband. Parte noef lehutza va'ara. He darts for the outside, runs, breaks down a fence, okay, and or a palm tree fence, something like that, depending on the interpretation you go with, and he runs off. Ama Rava, so they go before Rava and they say, this guy was with my wife, do I have to divorce her? This, by the way, seems like she was willing partner, and therefore it would be adultery, and he would have to divorce her. Ama Rava, ititasharye. She must be permitted to you. Why? Well, let's read the situation. What did he do? The guy, you showed up in the house. Normally, I don't know, if you ever see like a scene somewhere, what's the scene? They usually hide in the closet or something, right? So it's exactly what he says. If he really was doing something with her, he would have hid. And then you would never have found him. Here, you saw him running. Now you saw his face. You know who he is. You might go after him. If he really did something with your wife, there's no way he would have run away. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know, but that's his assumption. Last story. Now we have another adulterer. Notice the text even calls him an adulterer. Goes and was with this woman. Atagava, the man comes. Salik noef, itev bikali. Bava. He goes and he runs out and he sits behind the screen in the door. That's the way the Ran explains this. There was cress sitting there on the table. And before that, a snake had gone in. Remember, these snakes were very poisonous. They would put their venom into food and into drinks. So the husband's at home. He goes, right? He never saw the adulterer. He goes, he is about to eat this cress. His wife doesn't see him. So all of a sudden, the adulterer comes out and says, hey, don't eat that. There was a snake. A snake tasted this. Rava says, his wife is permitted. Why? He obviously would have been happy for the guy to die. He wants his wife. So what would he want more than the wife to die? Pasuk says, right? They went and committed adultery and blood is in their hands. Adulterers don't care about murder either, right? He'd be very happy if the guy died. He'd have his wife. Mara says, Pshita, that's pretty obvious. Why are you telling us this? Say, well, isura of it. Maybe really something happened, you might have thought. You might have thought that, let's try to read into the situation even more. Maybe he prefers a married woman. It's more, right? It's sweeter, something that's stolen. There's something more excitement to it. Maybe he prefer her be married, and maybe that's why he saved the husband. Doesn't mean they weren't together. Kamash malan, last words of the Gemara, fascinating, comes to teach you, no, that is not the case. With that, Hadran alach ve'elu Nedarim, u'slika la Masechet Nedarim, but I will not yet slika la Masechet Nedarim. We will not leave it until we make some sense out of all these stories. What are they doing here? So the first thing I want to show you is the Ran brings up, well, actually, we'll get to the Ran in a minute. Before we get there, I want to talk about, number one, you can't help but view this with the eyes of what goes on in our society nowadays. And in terms of, number one, the tension of who do we believe when, we have number one, believability, right? We always struggle with, how do you know if somebody comes forth with a claim? Can we believe them? Can we not? What tools do we use to figure that out? Number two, what happens when people abuse a system, right? We have a system of law, and already for many Masechtot, especially in Seder Nashim, we've been seeing a lot of people who abuse the system and how the system has to kind of function and create safeguards against people abusing the system. And it's a big struggle when you have a system because there's always going to be a weakness in terms of you can never really perfect everything. Like one example, is conversions, right? People convert in the country of Israel in order to get citizenship when they're not really trying to convert for the right reasons. And because of a few people who do that, it makes it much more difficult for people who really want to convert to properly convert, right? So this is something that the system, there's a bit of a weakness in the system. And I think that at the end of Masechet Nedarim, which was all about anytime you have a system with people, and what did people mean, right? We end this Masechet with, what did he mean when he ran? What did he mean when he tried to save the husband? What did she mean when she said those words? Did she mean them? Did she not? Was she really meaning, I just want to get out of this marriage? And Nedarim, it was all about, we spent almost an entire Masechet trying to figure out, what do people mean when they say these words? And I think that at the end of the Masechet, it's almost like the rabbis holding up their hands and saying, we understand that we're limited, and that in the end, we have a system and it's not going to be perfect, and we're not going to figure out everything 100%. But we need a system to be able to make general rules. And yet we understand that we're limited and that it might not always come out exactly the way you might want it to be, or there might be some issues about it. So I think that there's a certain amount of admission at the end of this Masechet that is a bit of an issue. That's number one. The second idea I wanted to talk about, and by the way, I wanted to just point out, because this always happens when you're learning, so when I read the Parsha last week, it really jumped out at me in the Parsha, and I wanted to just connect it to this idea. So when Moshe comes to Bnei Israel and he says, I'm going to save you, and they all believe him, and then it says Paro made it worse for them. And then all of a sudden it says the people, Lo shamu Moshe mikotzer ruach u'me'avodah kasha, right? They didn't listen to him anymore because they were tired, right? And it was hard for them. And there's many interpretations what exactly that means, but for whatever reason, they wouldn't listen to him. The next pasuk is, I'm reading in Shmot Vav, pasuk, Perek Vav, pasuk Yud. So Hashem says to Moshe, go speak to Paro, Melech Mitzrayim, and he'll send the Jewish people out. And Moshe says to him, what do you mean? Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elai, ve'ech yishmeini Paro v'ani arei al sfatayim. Says, the Jews don't listen to me, and Paro's not going to listen to me because I'm not a good orator, right? I'm not a good orator. I can't speak well. And what you see here is that Moshe didn't understand why the Jewish people didn't listen to him, right? They didn't listen to him. The pasuk tells you, it's mikotzer ruach u'me'avodah kasha. And the Chizkuni points this out. He says, Moshe lo hergish shemikotzer ruach lo shamu. And he thought it was a different reason. And I just thought that was exactly the point I wanted to make, which is that we all read into situations, and we read into situations what we think, right? Here, Moshe was coming with his weaknesses and thinking that it's my weaknesses that are causing the Jewish people not to listen to me, when in fact, that wasn't what it was. So I think it's a very strong idea about listening and what people think. The last thing I want to end with is this Ran. The last Ran in the Masechet, which is nice to end with him because he really helped us all along this Masechet, and in the absence of Rashi. And the Ran says here, there's a whole issue that I didn't want to get into, but that really the woman shouldn't be forbidden halachically, no matter what, even if he really had slept with her, because there needs to be certain kinds of proofs and things. And he quotes some things about a sota. So theoretically, she really, no matter what, halachically, she wouldn't be forbidden to her husband, unless you have real proof, which they didn't have. So what does it say here? The last few words of the Ran. If it weren't for those reasons that the Gemara brings here, if it weren't for the Rava coming along and saying you don't have to divorce her, every man would have felt like the right thing to do is to divorce her, even though the halacha doesn't say he does. And this is, I think, the most poignant point here at the end of our Masechet. What are Nedarim? And if you take all these sugyot that we've been learning since the Mishnah here, and all this, especially with the eyes of a woman, it seems like they're not believing the woman, and the woman wants to get out of marriage and they're not letting her, and all that. But really what's going on here is, in all the cases, they're basically saying you don't have to divorce her. You can stay married. So first of all, right, whether that's a good thing or not, that's a whole different discussion. But in those days, they believed that it was better for the woman if she stayed married, even though she doesn't think so. That's a whole different thing. But the goal here is that what they're saying is she's permitted to you, and don't forbid something that's actually permitted to you. And that's exactly what we've been discussing in our entire Masechet, which is Nedarim. They're not big fans of Nedarim, if that wasn't clear throughout the entire Masechet. And they don't want you forbidding things that are actually permitted to you. And what they're using here, are examples that every person can relate to, whether you're married or you have parents, or this issue of relationship between husband and wife, and they're using it as an example to say, don't forbid things that are permitted to you. And that's not the Jewish approach, and it's not what we are believers in. And now you can go back and think about all these stories within that way of viewing it. And I think that they really all fit into that. And that is the common denominator between all these, and that connects it with the Masechet that we've been learning. So with that, we will say the Hadrons now. Actually, Maggie, I'm going to need you to share the Hadrons because I don't have it accessible. Let's see, maybe I can open it in the chat. Okay, 1 second, and let's see if I can open it.
Send it to your WhatsApp as well.
Here we go. Okay, I got it now. I'll share it. Okay. Oops. Everybody ready? We're going to start the Hadrons. Hadran alach Masechet Nedarim, Hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Nedarim, v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitna sheminach Masechet Nedarim, v'lo titna sheminan, lo ba'alma hadin, v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Nedarim, v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Nedarim, v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitna sheminach Masechet Nedarim, v'lo titna sheminan, lo ba'alma hadin, v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Nedarim v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Nedarim v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitna sheminach Masechet Nedarim v'lo titna sheminan. Lo ba'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yehi ratzon l'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu. Shetehe toratcha u'manutenu ba'olam hazeh. Utehe imanu la'olam haba. Hanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha befinu v'fipiot amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzeenu tzetzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yod'ei shemecha v'lomdei toratcha lishma. Me'ovai techakmeni mitzvotecha ki la'olam hi li. Yehi libi tamim b'chutecha l'man lo evosh. La'olam lo eshkach pikudecha ki bam chiyitani. Baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chutecha. Amen, 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 sela va'ed. Yehi ratzon m'fanecha Adonai Elohai. Hashem she'azortani l'sem Masechet Nedarim. Ken ta'azreni להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם. ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו, שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקיים בנו בהלכתך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, והקיצות היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך, יוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בימינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. Wow, Mazal Tov to everybody finishing. Kol hakavod. We're going to start at the very beginning of Nazir, very, very briefly. We get to the rest of our program. The first Mishnah in Nazir starts off just like the Mishnah in Nedarim. It's very similar. And in fact, the whole first daf is going to be, part of it is going to be very similar. Kol kinuyei nizirut kinizirut. If you use a word to express you're going to be a Nazir, also if you use a word that's similar to it, it will be. And then it skips to yado without mentioning the word yad. You might remember what a yad is. It's an intimation. Ha'omer ehei. You say, I will be. Hareze Nazir. That seems a little strange. We're going to have to figure out what that is. Come to class tomorrow morning and you will see. And ha'omer ehei na'eh. I will be beautiful. That's also a Nazir because you're referring to your hair. Again, a little bit strange. Just because I say I will be beautiful, that means I want to be a Nazir. Already raising a lot of questions. We're going to stop here in the Mishnah. I'll just read through more words. Nazik, Naziach, Paziach. You might remember those. Hareza, Nazir. Those are kinuyim of Nazirut. And we'll end here for now with Nazir. Okay, if you want to get ahead on Nazir, Gita's introduction is already up on the site. Shuli Mishkan already put up an article about and flashback about actually talking about a Nazir that lived not very long ago in Israel. And Yafit Clymer, by the way, also it just went up today, a final B'machshava Shniya. It's our new, if you haven't seen it yet, it's a new shiur in English on the site, on second thought. And it's about the issue of a father and a husband nullifying vows, a very interesting perspective of how we view this as women, etc. So you can look at that. And just a few short other announcements, which is we're starting the skills class. So those who want to learn how to learn Gemara, we have a series of 4 of those going on in February, on Sundays in February. I hope you have no plans for the next 7 Sundays, because after that, we're going to be starting with 3 Sunday lessons of Rabbanit Le'asarna for part 2 of the Complete Beginner's Guide to Gemara. So that's going to be more of a lecture class. My class is a Chavruta class with both. Mine is more focusing on the skills and hers is on the background and the overview. The combination of the two should be good of getting you more into Gemara skills. And right after that week ends, then we're already finishing Nazir. So there you have it. Okay. I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, which is advocate Michal Cotler-Wunsh, who is a senior research fellow, public speaker, policy and strategy advisor. She most recently served in the Knesset, the 23rd Knesset, and among other things, co-founded the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Antisemitism. On top of all that, she happens to be a dear friend of mine, and throughout our many fascinating discussions that we've had over the last number of years, we always find a crossover between her work and my work. And that's why it's very exciting for me that on this topic, particularly of Nedarim and the power of words and what do our words mean, I really wanted to invite Michal to speak about. Title of her talk is Do Words Matter? Words enabling the mutation of anti-Semitism online, on campus, and on streets.
So first of all, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for including me in this, and mazel tov to everybody that completed. It's always very, very exciting and, sort of an incredible opportunity to talk about the additional voices that we're missing for so many thousands of years, as everybody that sat around the table represented, maybe viewpoint diversity, but it was only male viewpoint diversity. And knowing that this generation is an incredible historic junction that adds additional voices. And, Michelle and I were talking this morning about today's sort of complicated daf, and the notion that Me Too is not new at all, right? The understanding that in the sexual harassment context and allegations and he said, she said, the challenges have always been there. And I shared with Michelle anecdotally that actually as a member of Knesset, I submitted a legislative proposal to actually flip the burden of proof for consent so that, rather than women having the burden of proof on them, usually women in rape cases, then it would be men that would have to prove that there was consent. So it's a very interesting question, and about legislation generally and about the use of words, obviously, and of legal concepts. I wanted to talk a little bit, although it may seem disconnected. As Michelle said, there's often so many overlapping issues that we come to in our conversations. And to me, as I hear Michelle talking about this challenge, and as a lawyer, I think about sort of the shortcomings of the law. And, there's that good old euphemism that hard cases make bad law. But I would add that bad law makes hard cases as well. And so when we realize, and I'll move into the notion of the imperative to combat anti-Semitism in using definitions, the importance of definitions, and if anybody has seen, the ways that laws are structured, is that they first define the concepts that they're going to use. The importance of definitions is so critical, and the importance of their application consistently and equally becomes all that much more important when you realize the use and abuse that, whether it is that the rabbis anticipated might be made or that are actually made, as I'll talk about momentarily, in terms of co-opting constructs or, legal concepts, co-opting them and weaponizing them, and actually not only harming, those that are the subjects of those weaponized terms, but in fact, exactly as Michal pointed out in the Daf, in many ways undermining the entire system, the entire concept, or the entire legal construct. So I'll talk a little bit about what I call the mutation of anti-Semitism and the importance of understanding the power of words. And I'll just touch upon this. Of course, I could talk about this forever, but I won't. I'll talk about it for the next, 10 minutes or so. When I prepared for today, I thought that I would just start with the two legal concepts of crimes against humanity and of genocide that were coined actually post-World War II, post the Holocaust. And of course, we meet today on the week that we will be marking just this Friday, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So the notion that the terms crimes against humanity, coined by Lauterpacht, and genocide, coined by Lemkin, are terms that the two of them, each from a very different sort of beginning point. So one from international law and one from human rights, understood that what had happened, the atrocities of the Holocaust, were too terrible to be able to use existing terminology, and therefore coined these expressions. What we see when we come to the co-opting of terminology, the co-opting of words or of legal constructs that, as I said before, not only harm or enable the mutation of anti-Semitism, but collapse the entire infrastructure, is seen online in a very, very concrete way. And I'll share with you, I just received a report identifying the use of words, or what I call the appropriation of terminology, of human rights terminology, and its weaponization. And what we did was we asked an expert company to actually track the words. Genocide, of course, apartheid is there as well, and settler colonialism is there as well. And it corroborates exactly with events that occur in Israel. Most specifically for this report, it was around the 2021 war or operation in Gaza that showed spikes in the use of terminology of those specific terms, as I said, genocide, crimes against humanity, apartheid, and others, that actually not only enabled online virulent anti-Semitism, but we can now track, using that online or digital space, anti-Semitism and its real world harm. So almost predictive of where that real world harm will come up next. And in that sense, what I would share with you this evening, if you walk away with two things, remembering, from this portion of the shiur, it is the importance of the IHRA, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. So the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the result of nearly a 20-year democratic process, has been adopted by over 1,000 entities, something like 38 countries, cities, sports leagues, corporations. And again, when we spoke before about the importance of words, the IRA working definition understands specifically and precisely that defining defining anti-Semitism, not just as Holocaust remembrance, but as its current mutation and permeation, i.e. the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards against the state of Israel, enables to comprehensively identify anti-Semitism. And that definitions are critical if we're at all to be able to implement any sort of legal constructs in order to identify and combat manifesting challenges that we see societally, anti-Semitism being, an ancient toxic hate, ever mutating, by the way. So latching on to whatever social construct of the time in order to, be able to enable its mutation and permeation into societies. And so the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism is exactly a manifestation of the understanding of the importance of definitions. And I would say not only the adoption of the definition, but the implementation of the definition equally and consistently is an imperative that we see. Of course, the manifestations of that we see on campuses, on the streets, in workplaces. And so that Zionist coding Jew in many ways meets students across campuses, certainly North America, but around the world. in situations in which the appropriation of words has actually, if I flipped or, sort of gave another example, the appropriation of the word Zionist no longer means what Zionism is, which is that progressive national liberation movement that enabled the return of an indigenous people, Jews, to their ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality, just the Declaration of Independence. But rather, what Zionist today means is synonymous with racist, synonymous with homophobic. So everything that you can imagine is placed into that term, Zionism, appropriating a word that we know the definition of and enabling, from the flip side of the negative of Israel as an apartheid state and so on, enabling that appropriation, that mutation of anti-Semitism and the real world harm and real world harassment and real world violence that may begin in the online spaces, but spills over into, as we said before, the real world. Anecdotally, if any of you, obviously, you've heard about, groups being banned in Berkeley and so on, students not being able to join book clubs if they are any of the following: racists, homophobes, anti-Semites, or Zionists. So again, another example of the importance of preserving the definitions of words and ensuring that definitions of words actually are utilized even through the passage of time, and the understanding that use and abuse of legal constructs or legal concepts or terminology lends itself to the collapse of the infrastructure created to regulate societies in a way that, as Michel said, we need halacha or law in order to have social order. But when it's used or abused, it actually undermines the entire system. I think I'll end here because I don't want to take up too much of your time this evening, and I appreciate the time. And I wish you all continued learning with this incredible opportunity that you all have created in this community of learners. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. It's really great having you. Maggie, is Adina here? Okay, great. Our next speaker, Rabbanit Dr. Adina Sternberg. She's a Bible and Talmud scholar, unique educator. She teaches in a number of places in Bar Ilan's Midrashah. She teaches in Ephrata's Teachers College and also is now in a very unique program that Matan now has called Kitvuni, which is promoting publication of high-level Torah scholarship by women, which is a really, really important program. She'll be speaking about a very relevant and interesting topic for all of us who've learned Nedarim, about making vows and making changes from the biblical vows to modern halacha.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here together with you. It's nice to see so many people joining in from all over the world. This is a big zchut for me to be part of this. So yasher koach to Rabbanit Michal and to everybody who's been learning. What I want to do with you this evening is share some thoughts that I've gathered from some articles I've read and from the learning that we've done about Nedarim, about the vows, how it started, how it evolved. I called it making vows and making changes, and where the concept comes from and how it evolved through the years, where we'll address some of the topics that we've studied throughout the Masechet. So I would like to try to share my screen. Okay, you can see, right, the presentation? Great, wonderful. So what I want to do is I want to start with the psukim in the Tanakh and look at them and try to think what a vow is in the Tanakh itself, what function it fulfills, and then we'll be able to kind of compare it to what we see later on and what we've seen throughout the Masechet. So we're going to start with the first vow in the Tanakh, the vow of Yaakov Avinu that he makes after his dream, where he sees the angels going up and going down, and God makes promises. And then it says, Vayidar Yaakov neder le'emor. So Jacob makes the vow, saying, Im yeh Elohim imadi, ushmarani b'derech hazeh asher anochi olech, v'natani lechem le'echol v'gil lilbosh. So if God remains with me, protecting me on this journey that I am making, and giving me bread to eat and clothing to wear, ושבתי בשלום אל בית אבי, והיה השם לי לאלוהים, and I returned safe to my father's house, and Hashem shall be my God, or then Hashem will be my God, והאבן הזאת אשר שמתי מצבה יהיה בית אלוהים, וכל אשר תיתן לי עשר לעשרנו לך. So this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's abode, and of all that you give me I will set aside a eighth for you. So we see here a vow. We can say that the vow is that Yaakov is promising to do things. That's how we sometimes, and especially throughout this Masechet, look at a vow, promising to do things or to refrain from doing. But if we notice what Yaakov actually is doing here, he's sanctifying something. He's sanctifying this stone to become the house of God, God's abode, and he's sanctifying a tenth of everything that he gets from God. And we can, if we go out throughout the Tanakh, we can see that we can argue if it's 90% or 100% of the vows have to do with sacrificing, have to do with creating Kedusha in the world, with promising to give something to God. Okay, if we look at the psukim that talk about vowing, it might not be so apparent because it says, when you make a vow to God, Hashem, do not put off fulfilling it. For your God, Hashem will require it of you, and you will have incurred guilt, right? So you need to fulfill it on time. So, but it doesn't say fulfill. I mean, it says that in your translation, but that's not what it says in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, it says lo te'acher, which means don't be late. Leshalmo. Leshalem sounds, in modern day Hebrew, leshalem is to pay. But that's also not the exact word, so we'll think about it in just a second. Whereas you incur no guilt if you refrain from vowing. מוצא שפתיך תשמור ועשית כאשר נדרת להשם אלוהיך נדבה אשר דיברת בפיך. So we're talking, you must fulfill what has crossed your lips and perform what you have voluntarily vowed to your God, Hashem, having made the promise with your mouth. So here they talk about vowing and promising, neder and nedava. But nedava is not only a promise. Nedava has to do with the good of someone's heart, where he gives something, right? So the neder and the nedava, which we'll also see come together later on, has to do with not being late, lesharmu. Now, I brought a few psukim. I didn't even bring the translation because you miss out on the wording here, because it keeps on saying again and again the word leshalem together with a neder. But not only the word leshalem, we'll see other words. Vani bekol todah is bechalach, asher nadarti ashalema yeshuat Hashem. So we have the neder here, but it comes together with ezbecha, which means to sacrifice, ashalem, which is the word lishalem that we were just talking about, and todah, which is also a kind of a sacrifice. And I'll give you a hint, zevach and todah are sacrifices that have to do with shlamim, korban shlamim. So lo te'acher leshalmo is a play on words with the shlamim that we're supposed to bring. So usually a neder is to sanctify a korban. It could be a todah, a zevach, a shlamim. It could be other kinds of korbanot, like in Tehillim, avo beitcha be'olot, ashalem lecha nedarai. So here we have the olah, but also lishalem the nedarim, to pay, but to have shlamim. And we have also from Tehillim, from the Hallel, that we're all used to saying, Nedarai la'Hashem ashalem nigdana lechol amo, yakar b'nei Hashem avta l'chasida, v'ana Hashem ki ani avdecha ben amatecha pitachta l'mosarai. Okay, these are familiar psukim. I brought them just because of the familiarity. Lecha ezbach zevach todah u'v'shem Hashem. I will sacrifice to you the sacrifice of the todah, Uveshem Hashem, God, call out the name of God. Nedarai la'Hashem hashalem nigdana lechol amo. So we can see that the neders that we're paying or giving or fulfilling has a play on words with the shlamim and the whole world of sacrifices. So we can see that neder a lot of times comes together with sanctifying something. I think maybe one of the most common Nedarim that we think about, and this is already a good way to open up Masechet Nazir, is the Neder of the Nazir, of the Nazarene, right? וידבר השם אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם, איש או אישה כי יפליל לנדור נדר נזיר להזיר להשם. A person, a man or a woman, can have an involvement, a neder, a vow that makes him into a nazir. I'm not going to read all of the translation. He doesn't drink the wine, etc., and doesn't eat from the grapes, and he can't become impure, and he can't cut his hair. So it sounds here like this sounds a little bit more like the nedarim that we're used to from our Masechet, from refraining from doing things and promising yes to do things, etc. And then we continue. The Nazir has a lot of very numerous details after telling us what you do and you don't do during the time of the Nazirut. Then וזאת תורת הנזיר ביום מלות ימי נזרו, יביא אותו אל פתח אוהל מועד, and then needs to sacrifice all kinds of things. And there's whole big procedures that he goes through, bringing the offerings and even cutting his hair and burning it, etc. Now, again, we can look at the Nazirite as someone who promises to do something and he promises to refrain from stuff. And that gets it closer to our world where we think about people vowing as a way of committing themselves to do things or promising to do things, not promising not to do things. But even in the Nazirite, if we think about it, he's considered kadosh. Okay, in Pasuk Chet here, I'm going back, Kol Yamei Nizro, Kadosh hu LaHashem. There's something about what he is during the time when he's a Nazirite, his growing of his hair, the fact that he's making sure that he doesn't become impure, that he doesn't desecrate himself by drinking wine, is he sort of turns himself into being holy. He sanctifies himself. His neder brings this kedusha into the world, but the kedusha is now upon himself. And even if we don't want to go that far, we can go back to the things that happen at the end of this time when he's a Nazir and he brings a korban. We can, a person vows to become a Nazir, to become a Nazirite, and he has this 30 days or however many days that he decided that he's going to be a Nazirite. But at the end, he brings all these sacrifices and even sort of sacrifices his hair as part of this procedure. So we can see the Nazirite vow as sanctifying something, dedicating something to God. It can either be himself during the period of the Nazirite, or it can be what he brings at the end of the period, where he prepares himself throughout this period to be ready to bring the sacrifices at the end. Okay, so up till now, we talked about the, let's call it the original vows, what it means to vow, and mostly it means to sanctify something. How does that connect to what we have in our Masechet? In our Masechet, we see people promising things. We see people talking to each other using the vows. And if we look in Tanakh, actually, what people usually do in order to strengthen what they're trying to say, if people want, to convince, to take upon themselves something, they'll use words like Chai Hashem, Ko Yaseh Elohim v'cho Yosif. I want something to really happen. I'm going to make an oath, not a vow, an oath. I'm going to take God, bring him into the picture and say, whoa, what will God do to me if I don't do A, B, or C? Or just as God is alive, so I will do such and such and such. We sort of recruit God into our discourse to make sure that we're convincing and that we're really, whatever we say is really binding. In the story of Shaul, where he wants to kill his son Yonatan, so Shaul says, Chai Hashem, Ko Yaseh Elohim v'cho Yosif, if I don't do this, and then the people say to him, Chai Hashem, if you do. Like, that's the only force that we have against this oath. Interestingly, in the beginning of Shmuel, when Eli is trying to convince Shmuel to tell him what prophecy he saw, so he says, Al na techached mimeni, ko yaseh lecha Elohim v'cho Yosif, which is God will do to you so and so, without actually saying what God will do to you if you don't tell me the prophecy. And this is a good way to find out who's God-fearing and who's idol-worshipping. Because when we see the same words with Izebel, she's already saying, Ko yasun Elohim, v'cho yosifun. She's talking in plural about the gods, whereas when we talk about the God, we talk in singular. Okay, but so in the Tanakh, when people really wanted to strengthen what they say, they'd use an oath, not a vow. A vow is sanctified. So something changes from the time of the Tanakh to the times of Chazal, where in the times of Chazal, instead of using oaths all the time, we're sort of using vows all the time. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to, I brought here a source from Nedarim, where they're talking about what's the difference between a neder and a nedava. Okay, why is a neder different than a nedava? And what the source is telling us is that neder is a little bit tricky, because if somebody makes a neder, then if they sanctify an animal and the animal gets lost, then they're still responsible for bringing another animal because they made a neder to bring in an animal. Whereas in a device, they sanctified a specific animal. And then it says at the end of the source, the Tanya Amu al Hillel HaZaken, Shelo ma'al adam be'olato kol yamav, mevi'ah kshehi chulin la'azara u'mekadisha. Meaning, what Hillel said was, I'll sanctify it at the last moment possible, and then it won't get lost, and I won't be bound to bring another one. It's all tricky, and it's problematic. From here, we sort of understand that a person brings a neder, it's very binding, and it's a lot of responsibility. If you lose the one that you wanted, you need to get another one. So why would somebody want to do it? For that exact reason, a person wants to commit himself. A person wants to make sure that what he or she decided to do, they're actually going to do. It's a way of forcing yourself to do something. Now, when you force yourself to do something, sometimes you're going to end up being happy about it, but sometimes you're not, because you're really putting yourself into a situation. I'd even like to use a harsh word called manipulation. Okay? You're using the words to manipulate yourself, your future self, to fulfill what your present self wants you to do. Okay? So you're creating the certain kind of a binding commitment that will afterwards make you responsible for so many things that you might not actually want to, because there are so many things that can happen on the way. Now, in a sense, what you're doing is you're tying your hands. It's a way, again, of your present day self to commit your future self, to bind your hands, to put yourself into a commitment you can't get out of. Now, we like to do that a lot of times. Use halacha, use Torah in order not to have to deal with making decisions. For example, if I know that I want to be on a diet and I don't want to be eating ice cream, all I need to do is make myself fleishich, and then I won't eat the ice cream. So that's a way where I'm manipulating myself, right? I'm using the Torah and Halacha to manipulate myself and to cause me to do something or not to do something because of my commitment. Like my past actions are committing my future self, so I can't do something because religiously I can't allow myself to. Now, in a sense, this is a kind of manipulation. If we think about it, also when a Chana makes her vow, where she promises God such a big promise to give him her firstborn son if she gets a son, she's also manipulating God. She's using this neder, this vow, to force God into giving her what she wants. It's a way of, I'll promise you X if you give me Y. It's not manipulating your future self, even though that's also, but it's a way of trying to gain control of the situation. Later on, Chazal will also see Chana as being manipulative in other ways of using halacha in order to force God into doing what she wants. Okay. So what do we see now? There are some scholars who say that Chazal preferred it this way, meaning Chazal didn't want people to be making a lot of oaths, because then they're taking the words of God and desecrating them. Because involving God in an interpersonal relationship is not a good idea. It's unnecessary desecration of the name. So Chazal kind of twisted the history or twisted the halacha or reshaped the halacha and said, you know what, keep God out of it, but you can use vows. How do you do that? You'll, instead of vowing to give something, to sanctify something, say that something is prohibited as if it was sanctified. Okay, so we're using our words to make something into something else, to put a certain kind of title over something. It's not a title over an animal that's going to be shechted. It's a title over the chocolate that I'm not going to eat now. Okay? But because we don't want the oath, which is really binding and also can use God's name in vain. But then what happens is that once we've opened this up, people will use the vows not only to manipulate themselves, to cause themselves to do things that they're committed to, but also to manipulate other people. And then Chazal will say, we have all kinds of nedarim, nidrei ziruzim, nidrei havai, nidrei shgagot, nidrei onasim, right? Vows of extortion, vows of exaggeration, vows that are unintentional, vows that are fulfillment has to do with circumstances, all kinds of things where people are so used to using the vows to manipulate themselves and manipulate others that we already know that we can't take seriously a lot of what people are saying. And afterwards, what we understand is that vow becomes a certain kind of interpersonal thing. Now, the Torah talks about the vows in an interpersonal connection, because it talks about a husband being able to annul his wife's vows, right? Haisha, for example, Haisha shenadra benazir v'shama bala v'lo efer la. A husband can, if he wants, nullify a vow, right? And he has that option, maybe because he doesn't want to pay the money for giving the korbanot. Maybe it has all kinds of implications on his life. But now, the Tosefta tells us, since he has this option to nullify the vow, if he uses the option or doesn't use the option, also becomes a question of interpersonal relations. Okay? So what happens if he doesn't nullify it? Rabbi Meir v'Rabbi Yehuda omer, hu noten etzba ben shinea. Im ratza le'efer, efer. Okay? Second. Okay, he's like sticking his finger in her mouth. I think I maybe miscopied this, but there are two ways of looking at the husband's way of nullifying the vows. One option is he has this right, but he also has the right of saying, I don't want my wife vowing all these vows and it gives me too much trouble and I don't want it. But another way is to say he becomes responsible for her vows, meaning once a husband has the right to nullify his wife's vows, it becomes sort of a game between them. It becomes a question, who's manipulating who? Is she manipulating him? Is he manipulating her? How is this relationship built? And I think manipulation might be a little bit harsh, but it's like if we use the vows as trying to make a commitment, but it's a commitment that's also dependent on somebody else, it also becomes a form of communication where someone says something about themselves and has a certain expectancy of somebody else replying. Okay, I think one of the most important sugyot here, and I'll finish with this, is a very pretty, very nice, interesting sugya, where it talks about, we go back to Masechet Ketubot, and Masechet Ketubot tells us that if a husband makes a vow that he won't have relations with his wife, then there's a machloket if 1 week or 2 weeks, and afterwards it's considered a breach of the marriage, and then he needs to give her a get and a ketubah and let her go. And then there's another place where it sounds like after 1 day already he needs to give her the ketubah. Okay, it talks about the situation where she makes a vow. She makes a vow that she's not going to put on her makeup or whatever adornments. But if she does, then she will not be allowed to have intercourse with her husband. Right? So then the Gemara asks afterwards, okay, So what will happen if she puts on her adornments and then they will be prohibited having intercourse? Why does he need to let her go that day? Maybe we can have a week or 2 weeks. Why is this considered at the same day already a breach of this commitment of the marriage? And then the Gemara says something beautiful. It says, Hani mile heicha de adra ihu. When he's the one who makes the vow, we give him time. De savra mirdach ratach ilavai, vehashta yativ date. She says, he's angry. He makes this vow out of anger, but I know after a week or two he'll calm down. Everything will be okay. Aber hacha de nadra ihi v'shatikla. She's the one who makes the vow and says, I'm not going to be able to have intercourse with you. And he doesn't say anything about it. Savra mide ishtak misnahu desani. She says, if he didn't nullify this vow, that means he hates me. In other words, the Gemara here is assuming or understanding that sometimes people make a vow as a way of expressing anger. I'm so angry, I can't have intercourse with you now for 2 weeks. And we might be okay with that. We might accept that this is a certain way of expressing feelings. But when a woman makes the vow, she doesn't want him to shut up and say, okay, be angry and we'll wait till it goes over. She's waiting for him to say, no, my lovely, how can you say such a thing? I love you, okay? Or for example, she stands in front of the mirror and she says, oh my God, I'm so fat, I'm not eating chocolate anymore. She's not waiting for him to say, okay, my lovely, whatever you say. What she wants him is to say, Chas v'chalila, you're beautiful. You can't say no to chocolate because you're so beautiful. Meaning, when a woman makes a vow, it's a certain kind of communication. It's a way of expressing something where she knows that her husband has a way to reply and she's waiting for that reply. There's so much more to say, but I'm just going to finish with the following words. Chazal, by enabling people to, instead of making an oath and that way express things towards themselves, towards other people, they use the neder to say, okay, I'm taking the world of Kedusha and using it to create an isur, making myself, forcing myself to do A and B or not to do whatever. And by there also incorporating the ability of a husband to nullify his wife's vows, a vow becomes a way of expression. It becomes a way of communication. When someone's angry, he'll make a vow. When a wife is angry, she'll make a vow, but she'll want her husband to be responsive to this vow. It will be part of their discourse. But the truth is that we don't like it. We didn't like the oaths, and so we switched it with the vows, but we don't really like the vows because vows are manipulation, and vows are forcing yourself to do something, your future self, something that maybe your present self wants, but your future self might not want. And it's a way of also manipulating your spouse and the people around you and your neighbors. And we see that throughout the whole Masechet. And therefore, we will see all kinds of chachamim that will not accept, will not play along. You made a vow, I don't care, I'm not playing your game. And because of that, we can see that Be'emet, all these situations that we find in Masechet Nedarim put together and give you such a feeling that everybody's making a vow morning, evening, and afternoon, we don't have that anymore. What I grew up is saying bli neder all day long, right? Anytime you say something, bli neder, bli neder, bli neder. So I think that Chazal have taught us, even though they've created this world where people communicate through vows, they've also kind of put it aside and said, you know what? It's not a good idea to make these nedarim. It's not a good idea to use these manipulations. It's not a good idea to making all kinds of binding things. Try to use regular communication. Try to talk. Try to open up your feelings without binding yourself or your spouse or your neighbor. And maybe it's a good idea just to resolve things in more peaceful manners. So I think that's a good way. Where we go on to Masechet Nazir, we leave the vows in the realm of Kedusha, in the realms of trying to connect to God and be closer to Him. And for interpersonal relationships, we should try better. That's it.
Wow, beautiful idea. Really a beautiful way of framing everything that we've been learning this Masechet. And I looked up while you were speaking. I know you spoke about Shvuot, so everybody, you now have till May of 2025 to stick with this to get to Masechet Shvuot, where we can deal with oaths. So thank you very much. I want to thank all of our speakers tonight. I want to thank Maggie for all her hard work behind the scenes, Maggie Sandler. I want to thank all of you who are here tonight, all of you who are finishing, who are part of the learning community. If you're here and you're not finishing, it's also amazing that you're here. And everyone who joined Hadran's Circle of Friends, I want to thank you. We had an overwhelming response, which was really amazing. It's not too late to join our Circle of Friends, which basically enables us to be able to do our programming. I want to thank also those who come to the daily Zoom, so I can feel like I have human interaction. For those who haven't yet tried it, I recommend it. The conversations after the daf is over are very, very insightful, very intriguing, and a lot of questions and a lot of discussions. So those who share your thoughts on the WhatsApp groups, and if you're part of a group, feel free to share your thoughts and communicate with other people. It enables the learning to really be a connector between all of us. Thank you all for being here. Mazal tov.
Mazal tov, everybody.
Mazal tov to everyone.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Mazal tov.
Toda rabba.
Mazal tov.
Love the podcast.
Thank you. Toda rabba.
Wonderful.
Mazal tov, thank you.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And may Michelle and the Hadran keep go from strength to strength.
Amen.
Amen. Caroline, I recognize your voice.
Thank you so much.
I can hear my brother on here.
All right, everyone. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We'll meet soon, Bli Neder.